Housing has been and continues to be one of the foremost issues facing Americans, especially in the 21st century. And since the 2008 housing crisis, housing costs have increased at unprecedented rates. For the past 2 decades, rental and buying prices have been rising faster than income across most regions of the US. From 2000 to 2020, median rents rose faster than median household income in 88% of US counties, which affects 97% of the US population. This is partially due to the fact that estimated housing demand rose by 26% over the same time period, while housing supply increased by only 19%. So the question experts and policymakers have continued to ask, without any serious answers, is how to reverse the trend. The two sides of the political spectrum tend to fall into one of two camps. One is to deregulate the housing market and slash zoning laws to allow developers to create what the market needs. And the other is to build more public housing to specifically help lower-income Americans who can't keep up with the surge in pricing. And this video is to discuss why the latter does not and has never really worked. Public housing initiatives began in the 1930s under FDR's New Deal with the creation of the Public Works Administration. While also building large-scale public infrastructure such as dams, bridges, hospitals, and schools, a main focus was to build public housing for the urban poor. Over the span of its 10 years, the PWA constructed a total of 52 housing communities for a total of 29,000 units, which was less than what many supporters of public housing had hoped for, with the first public housing project in U.S. history being the whites-only Techwood Homes in Atlanta, Georgia. And that's an issue I'll address up front. A massive criticism of public housing from the beginning has been the location and segregation of low-income communities. Now, I don't think that's as relevant of an argument against public housing going forward, but it is emblematic of what can happen when you allow the government to decide where people live. Public housing is all too often placed further away from jobs and public transportation, resulting in even deeper economic and social isolation. By segregating similarly poor and minority residents in these public units, public housing projects have led to the perpetuation of government-backed ghettos. And it doesn't help that housing and urban development inspectors often give passing grades to public housing complexes showing clear signs of toxic mold, asbestos, and lead paint, or where raw sewage is regularly backed up and furnace boilers give out in the dead of winter. Take Concordia Place Apartments in Chicago's impoverished Riverdale neighborhood, where HUD's inspectors gave the public housing complex a score of 94, far above the passing grade of 60, yet one tenant said of the rodents, you could hear them at night crawling on the walls. Now, where you can argue that tenants do bear some responsibility for the cleanliness of their unit, there's a limit to how much they can do, and I'd say if it's clear the tenant is neglecting their unit, they should be evicted. But the federal government does not have a good track record of repairing its housing units. Just look at military housing as a parallel example. Let's move on to the issue of cost and efficiency. From 2016 through 2021, the HUD Housing Trust Fund was given a budget of $1.2 billion. Of that $1.2 billion, only $360 million was actually dispersed, and $100 million spent on completed housing projects. With this $100 million, they were able to build 521 new housing units and acquired another 22, for a total of 543. So over this time, with an authorized budget of $1.2 billion, they were able to spend $100 million on a total of 855 projects if you include rehabs, or 213 per year. In a recent review of a HUD program designed to build and preserve affordable housing, average per unit cost was $232,000. And those units aren't homes, they're units. 57% are one-bedroom apartments and 26% are two-bedroom. This is in the higher end of cost per unit, and if you've ever been in a government housing unit, they certainly aren't higher end, or in areas with high real estate values. So why do public housing projects cost so much? The answer is the same as most government contracts: bureaucracy, red tape, and self-imposed restrictions. A major problem, maybe the biggest, isn't even the federal government's fault. It's zoning laws created by localities that restrict what can be built and where. Restrictive land use regulations and zoning laws have been linked to higher housing prices, reduced construction activity, and a decrease in elasticity of housing supply. This includes policies like inclusionary zoning, which incentivizes developers to include a certain percentage of affordable housing units in a new development. These policies act as an additional tax on developers and lead them to either construct smaller buildings to avoid the tax or opt to do business in areas without inclusionary zoning policies. For example, a study of Los Angeles' transit-oriented communities program, which provides bonuses when units are restricted to lower-income households, models a decline from 400,000 total units built over 10 years without inclusionary zoning to below 250,000 units with a 20% inclusionary zoning requirement. Raising inclusionary zoning to just 1% significantly reduces market rate housing production by around 71,400 units over a 10-year period. For each additional percentage of inclusionary zoning between 1 and 16%, market rate housing decreases by 4,600 to 11,900 units. By the time inclusionary zoning reaches 17%, market rate production is reduced by almost half. Getting rid of zoning requirements by eliminating policies like single-family zoning, height restrictions, setback requirements, minimum floor areas, minimum lot size requirements, pretty much any regulations that don't directly regard safety, give developers much greater room to address the needs of the market and create more efficient use of available land in dense areas, something the government will never do because the public agencies are not real estate developers. Another problem is the concentration of federal funds to organizations and landlords who accept Section 8 payments. Many do not, which narrows the options of low-income people and constricts the opportunity to move if needed. Plenty of Section 8 landlords, or slumlords as I sometimes refer to them, know that the tenants in their units are trapped, especially in rural areas with few public housing options. So why would they bother putting any money or work into keeping the place up? They're not going to stop getting paid because people need the place to live. Yet they charge around median rent for units that are well below median quality. And like I mentioned before, HUD is not upholding any actual standard to force repairs. And on the public side of the issue, tenant rent cannot fund repairs and maintenance on its own. Take Philadelphia today, where tenant rent covers just 6% of the housing authority's budget. And no wonder, the typical household in public housing pulls an annual income of just $14,444 a month, with a minimum rent of $50. The reality is that deeply affordable housing is unaffordable to maintain or sustain on rents alone, which impossibly demands ever-increasing levels of federal subsidy across time and presidential administration. And the government can't even get on the same page as its agencies. From the outset, the federal government tried to leave maintenance funding and procedures up to each of the local housing authorities, presuming that rental revenue at each development would cover maintenance costs. Housing authorities, which tasked third-party property management companies to oversee repairs, were able to blame lack of federal funds or mismanagement for lax or inconsistent upkeep, and management companies could point to low rental revenue to justify deferred maintenance. So the federal government and local housing authorities are just as bad as private landlords at maintaining their properties. While I would prefer to entirely privatize these programs, since the government is always less efficient and sell all public housing property to private developers, if people want to save public housing initiatives, changes in policy and structure need to be made. I talked about the first change earlier in zoning laws. Tying one arm behind the back of land developers is certainly going to hinder the market and prevent producers from providing what the consumers need. So many of those need to go, especially in more densely populated areas. The second is to start treating Section 8 in the same way the Department of Defense treats the Overseas Housing Allowance, and deposit a tenant's exact rent to them plus average utility costs, unless utilities are included in the rent. Max amount allowed would depend on a percentage of the median rent for that zip code, and this would allow all Section 8 recipients to go out into the housing market and choose a place that might actually be taken care of by the owner and provide them the opportunity to actually make meaningful changes to their life. If they want to get a nicer place above the max federal allowance for that zip code, then they'll have to contribute their own money, similar to the contribution requirement for the voucher system currently. The benefit to this is expanding the options low-income people have for housing and integrating them into broader society instead of concentrating them in seemingly hopeless government-funded ghettos. Most studies actually show that crime isn't necessarily a result of low-income housing, but a precursor. Crime will drive down the price of an area, and so the government will buy it for the next project because it's cheap. And then concentrating a large group of poor people there reduces the economic activity of the area. Businesses move out, reducing job opportunities, and driving more of those same people to desperation or complacency. So crime isn't necessarily caused by affordable housing projects, but it can be exacerbated by it. And people act like the people around them. Mindsets are contagious, especially for children. So allowing lower income people to have more choice in where they live, being around people with all different types of jobs and income levels, could help motivate them to improve their own lives and take more opportunities, instead of accepting a life on government assistance. That being said, this would come with strings. At least in my world it would. One that I'm firm on is drug testing requirements for all government assistance, not just Section 8. If you can't afford to keep yourself alive, then you probably shouldn't be going around buying drugs. Another is semi-annual inspections of the unit, like actual inspections, not whatever HUD is calling inspections now, and with real repercussions if the tenant or landlord is neglecting the property. And the last will likely be the most controversial, and that's making full Section 8 funding a term payment, meaning that after a certain amount of time, the amount that a person can get decreases, as a real way to light a fire under someone and get them moving, because I refuse to accept complacent welfare queens. Now, the term condition could be extended if there are children in the house, or if they're over the age of retirement, but providing that makes it difficult not to incentivize just continuously having kids to keep the money flowing. So maybe the condition would have to be kids under school age, or something along those lines. So if you have an idea for that or anything else, feel free to leave it in the comments. Again, I would love to see all of this move over to the private sector, but I know perfectly well with government gridlock that public housing initiatives are likely not going anywhere anytime soon, especially since it's not even close to being our most expensive entitlement. So if that's the case, the changes I've mentioned in this video can at least make the system and market more efficient to meet the needs of low-income Americans and lower the cost of building projects. Obviously, there are plenty of other factors that play into the housing market overall, but those issues will have to wait for another video. Thank you for watching. Let me know what course you think we should take when it comes to public housing programs in the comments. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.